You may recall the term inversions from study of intervals, where you talk about the interval between two pitches inverting when you reverse the order of those pitches. In other words, one that was lower then becomes higher, and then one that was higher then becomes lower. For example, when we talked about an E going up to a G, we call that a minor third, but if G is the lower note and E is the upper note, a G up to an E or an E down to a G would be a major sixth. Those are interval inversions. We also use the term inversions when referring to different ways of voicing chords. Specifically, an inversion of a chord applies anytime some member of the chord other than the root serves as the lowest sounding note. Up until now, we've talked about chords and specifically triads where the root is always the lowest note, and that is called root position. However, sometimes the third of the chord will be the lowest note, other times the fifth of the chord will be the lowest note. Having the third as the lowest note or the fifth as the lowest note makes that chord inverted. So when we talk about inversions of triads, we have two possibilities, a first inversion and a second inversion. And I like to think of those as the first way of messing with the chord structure in terms of the lowest note, and the second way, or the second inversion of adjusting that chord. So when we have a first inversion, that applies when the next higher member of the chord beyond the root is going to serve as the lower note. So the third in the bass, or the third as the lowest member of the chord, is going to be a first inversion. Then a second inversion is when we take the remaining member of the triad, the fifth, and put that in the bass. So again, a first inversion refers to a chord where the third of the chord is the lowest sounding note, or the third of the chord is in the bass, and a second inversion applies when the fifth of the chord, or the fifth, is in the bass. So to illustrate this idea of inversions, we're going to kind of mess with this C major chord that I've got in front of us. In both examples here, I want you to notice that I have a C major triad in root position. And both of these are C major triads in root position because they consist of the notes C, E, and G, right? Even though here they're kind of packed together in what we call close position, and here in kind of an open position, the fact that those notes are present makes this a C major chord in really both instances, and the fact that the lowest sounding note among each of these groups is in fact a C tells us that it's in root position, right? So fair enough, root position C major. So when we talk about inversions, again, we're taking one of these members of the chord other than the root, and we're going to go ahead and let that be the lowest sounding note in the chord, right? So if I want to talk about a first inversion, then that means that the third of the chord is in the bass. Now, I know that's confusing because we use numbers in so many different ways. It's not terribly logical on the face of it to say that a first inversion means that the third is in the chord, which is why the way I think of it is I think of it as being, leaving root position and thinking about the first way in which I mess with the lowest note in that chord. So I think about a root position triad in kind of packed in or closed position, and the first way I can take it out of root position, the next thing above that root is the third. Okay, so I'm going to take that third and I'm going to put that in the bass, right? Or I'm going to make that the lowest sounding note, right? So I'm going to still keep the same collection of notes. I'm still going to have a C. I'm still going to have a G, but I'm going to take my E and make that the lowest sounding note. That is what makes this a first inversion triad, right? Now, I want to talk about what can be a misconception. There's a misconception that a first inversion triad not only has to have the third of the chord in the bass or as the lowest sounding note, but somehow that the root has to be at the top of the stack, right? That's not really going to determine one way or the other whether it's a first inversion triad. Here's what I mean. I can keep that E in the bass, try that a little bit more neatly. I can keep that E in the bass. I can have the next sounding note or the next higher note be my root, and I can have the top of that chord be a G, right? So, but this is still a first inversion triad because I have all of the notes that are part of the C major triad. C is the root, E is the third, G is the fifth. They're all there, and there are no other notes present. That makes it a C major triad. And within that, I have the third of the chord as the lowest sounding note. It doesn't matter if above that third I have fifth then root, or root then fifth. The positions of the remaining members of the chord are really irrelevant. It's a matter of which member of the chord is the lowest. That is what determines the inversions for us. Okay, so that's an example in first inversion. So now we'll talk about second inversion. And hopefully by now you can kind of start to predict. I'm going to still have the same notes. I'm still going to have a C, that's the root of the chord. I'm still going to have an E, right? But the lowest sounding member of the chord, instead of being the root or the third, this is now not the first way of changing things up, but the second way of changing things up. That's what makes it a second inversion. I'm going to have the fifth as the lowest sounding note, okay? So here it is in kind of close position, kind of stacked with the fifth on the bottom, root in the middle, third on the top. But the only part of that, construction that makes this a second inversion is the fact that the fifth is on the bottom. So I could have a G as my lowest sounding note. Okay, I could have the next higher note be an E, and then the top note be a C, or the root of the chord. Again, the ordering of the remaining members above the bass is irrelevant to determining which inversion we're talking about. So this open position version, right, where we've kind of flipped the positions of the root and the third, it's still a second inversion because we have all of the members of the C major triad and only the members of the C major triad, and I've taken the fifth of the triad and put that in the bass. That's what makes that a second inversion chord.